The air in the Leyte jungle was a thick, suffocating blanket of decay and damp earth. For weeks, it had been the only air Akiko Tanaka knew. The constant drumming of rain on the giant palm leaves was a miserable symphony, punctuated by the terrifying crescendo of American artillery. The Imperial Japanese Army's defense of the Philippines was collapsing, not in a heroic charge, but in a slow, starving, fever-ridden retreat. Akiko, a 21-year-old auxiliary nurse from Kagoshima, was no soldier. She had come to serve the emperor, to bind the wounds of his glorious warriors. Now her uniform was a tattered rag, her face gaunt from hunger, and her medical kit contained nothing but moldy bandages. The warriors she was meant to heal were phantoms in the jungle, succumbing to malaria and dysentery far more often than to American bullets. Beside her, huddled under the gnarled roots of a banyan tree, was Hanasato. Hana's eyes were wide with a feverish terror that hadn't faded for days. "They are close, Akiko-san," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "The American demons." Akiko didn't answer. Her fingers instinctively went to the left strap of her cotton brassiere. Sewn deep within the fabric was a tiny glass vial, no bigger than a grain of rice. Potassium cyanide, her Gyokusai, her shattered jewel. It was the final honorable duty of a daughter of Japan, a last act of defiance against the dishonor of capture. The military instructors had been clear. Surrender was a fate worse than any death. They had shown them drawings of monstrous American soldiers, promising fates of unspeakable brutality for any woman who fell into their hands. Death was a clean escape. Death was loyalty. From the diary of Akiko Tanaka, undated entry. "Father told me to be a credit to our name, to serve His Majesty the Emperor with my life. The vial feels heavy, a sacred weight against my skin. It is my final honor. I will not fail. I will not become a ghost, shamed in the eyes of my ancestors. The jungle eats us. Soon, a choice will have to be made." The moment came without ceremony. It wasn't a monstrous demon that found them, but a boy. An American GI, his face smeared with mud and exhaustion, couldn't have been older than she was. He stumbled through the undergrowth, his rifle held loosely. When he saw them, he froze. For a long second there was no soldier, no nurse, just 3 terrified young people in a sweltering jungle hell. The GI, whose helmet identified him as Sergeant Miller, lowered his weapon slightly. "It's okay," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "The war is over for you." Hana began to sob, a weak, helpless sound. Akiko's hand trembled over the vial. This was it, the moment of truth. She looked at the American's tired eyes, then at Hana's pathetic, shuddering form. Her promise, her honor, her emperor, it all felt distant, an abstract concept from another world. In this world there was only rain, hunger, and a profound, bone-deep weariness. With a slow, deliberate movement that felt like a betrayal of her entire existence, Akiko Tanaka raised her empty hands. The journey out of the jungle was a slow, stumbling nightmare. Sergeant Miller, whose first name Akiko later learned was John, led them with 2 other soldiers. They formed a small, ghostly procession through the sucking mud. Akiko expected a shove, a curse, a rifle butt to the back. Instead, Miller offered her his canteen. She stared at it, uncomprehending. Water. Clean water. Her throat was a desert, but her mind screamed poison. "It's just water," Miller said, his voice soft. He took a sip himself to prove it, then offered it again. Hesitantly, watching him with the suspicion of a cornered animal, Akiko drank. The water was lukewarm and tasted of metal, but it was the most life-giving thing she had ever swallowed. Miller then broke a bar of chocolate in half, handing a piece to her and one to Hana. The propaganda films had shown Americans as leering monsters who feasted on cruelty. They did not show them sharing chocolate with tired, muddy faces. This simple kindness was more disorienting than any brutality would have been. It chipped away at the foundation of her world. Hana, delirious with relief and exhaustion, ate her piece greedily, but Akiko held hers, the wrapper crinkling in her trembling hand. Every act of decency from the enemy felt like a fresh accusation. They were not the demons she was prepared to die to escape. So what did that make her? A coward who had forsaken her duty for a sip of water and a piece of candy? The cyanide vial, still pressed against her skin, felt like a burning coal of shame. She had failed her emperor. She had failed her father. She had failed herself. From the diary of Akiko Tanaka, undated entry, they speak in a language of gestures, a sip of water, a piece of sweet brown food. I ate it. The sweetness was a shock, a betrayal. It tasted of surrender. Hana-san cried with gratitude, but I feel nothing but a hollow ache. The demons are not what we were told. They are just men. Tired men. This truth is a heavier burden than any hatred. If they are men, then my choice to live was not a clever survival against monsters, but a simple failure of the spirit. They reached a makeshift collection point by a muddy road as dusk fell. Trucks rumbled past, filled with grim-faced American soldiers. A medical tent had been erected and the air smelled of antiseptic and gasoline. They were led to a processing line with a handful of other captured Japanese, mostly walking skeletons pulled from the jungle. No one spoke. The shame was a palpable silence, a shared cloak of disgrace. An American officer with a clipboard looked them over, his eyes lingering on Akiko and Hana, the only women there. He barked an order to a female military police officer standing nearby. The MP, a tall, stern-looking woman, approached them. It was then that Akiko's heart began to pound a new, terrifying rhythm. The ordeal was not over. It was just beginning. They were led into a canvas tent illuminated by a single, naked bulb that hissed and threw long, dancing shadows. The air was cold. A different female MP, a stout woman with a weary, impassive face, stood waiting. Her name tag read, Corporal Davis. With her was a Nisei translator, a Japanese-American soldier whose face was a mask of conflicting duties. He would not meet their eyes. Hana was trembling uncontrollably, her teeth chattering. Akiko stood rigid, her posture a brittle imitation of defiance. The real battle was happening inside her, a storm of panic and resolve. The cyanide vial felt like a mountain against her collarbone. The translator spoke, his voice flat and rehearsed. "You must be searched. It is a standard procedure, to ensure you carry no weapons or intelligence." Akiko's heart hammered against her ribs. Weapons. She had one, the most personal weapon of all. Corporal Davis gestured for them to remove their tattered blouses. Hana complied with a quiet sob, her thin shoulders shaking. Akiko hesitated. This was the line, the final boundary of her dignity. To be stripped, examined like an animal by the enemy. This was the precise dishonor her instructors had warned of, the shame from which the vial was meant to be the sacred escape. The translator's voice became a little sharper. "Please, it will be faster if you cooperate." With wooden movements, Akiko unbuttoned her blouse. The cold air hit her skin. She was left standing in her thin cotton chemise and bra. Corporal Davis stepped forward, her hands clinical and impersonal. She patted down Hana's sides and back quickly, then turned to Akiko. This was it, the moment of discovery. Akiko braced herself. She imagined the exclamation, the rough grab, being dragged away as a spy or saboteur. Perhaps this was her fate. Not a quiet, honorable death, but a loud, violent one. Corporal Davis's hands were rough but efficient. They moved over Akiko's ribs, her back, her waist. Then they moved upwards. Her fingers methodically traced the straps of Akiko's bra. Time seemed to slow. Akiko could feel the MP's thumb press directly against the tiny, hard lump sewn into the fabric. She held her breath. Her life, her death, her honor, it all balanced on the perception of this one enemy soldier. The thumb paused. It pressed again, lightly, as if testing a seam. For an eternal second the world was silent save for the hissing of the lamp. Then the hand moved on, patting her shoulder before dropping away. Davis stepped back and gave a curt nod to the translator. She hadn't felt it. Or, if she had, she dismissed it as a poorly stitched repair. From the testimony of Akiko Tanaka, post-war tribunal records, she touched it. The American woman, her hand was right there. I thought, this is the end. But then, nothing. She moved on, and in that moment the relief I expected did not come. Instead, a great black wave of guilt. I had been subjected to the ultimate shame I had sworn to die to avoid, and the tool of my honor, the Emperor's final gift, had been touched and ignored by the enemy. It was no longer a sacred jewel. It was just a secret, a coward's secret. After the search, they were given new clothes. The fabric was a coarse, olive-green cotton, stamped with the block letters U.S. It was the uniform of the enemy. Wearing it felt like being wrapped in a burial shroud of shame. They were loaded onto a truck with a dozen other prisoners and driven to a larger, more permanent enclosure, a sprawling camp of tents and barbed wire under the unforgiving Philippine sun. This was the Santo Tomas internment camp on the outskirts of Manila, a place that had once held American civilians and was now being repurposed by General MacArthur's forces to house the thousands of Japanese surrendering across the islands. The days settled into a monotonous, soul-crushing routine. Roll call at dawn. A metal tray with a scoop of rice and a ladle of watery vegetable stew. Another roll call at dusk. In between, there was nothing but time. Time to sit in the suffocating heat of the tent. Time to watch the American guards patrol the wire, their faces bored and indifferent. This ordered, predictable existence was a special kind of torture. In the jungle, Akiko had been a servant of the Emperor, engaged in a noble, if doomed, struggle. Here she was a number, a mouth to feed, an administrative problem. The Americans gave them medicine for their malaria and dysentery. They treated their infected wounds. This clinical, impersonal care was worse than any cruelty. It stripped them of their identity as warriors and nurses, reducing them to mere biological organisms in need of maintenance. Hana, however, was beginning to thrive. The regular food put color back in her cheeks. The safety from artillery and starvation allowed her a lightness Akiko found repellent. One afternoon, as they sat in the shade of their tent, Hana laughed at a clumsy joke made by another prisoner. The sound was like a slap. "How can you laugh?" Akiko hissed, her voice low and venomous. Hana's smile vanished. "We are alive, Akiko-san. We survived." "We were supposed to die," Akiko retorted, her hands clenched into fists. "That was our duty. That was our honor. Every bite of their food you eat, every night you sleep safely in their tent, you disgrace the memory of those who did their duty." "My duty is to live," Hana whispered back, tears welling in her eyes. "What honor is there in a rotting corpse in the jungle? Maybe we will see home again." "There is no home for us," Akiko said, her voice hollow. She turned away, her hand instinctively rising to her collarbone. The vial was still there, a constant, silent accusation. From the diary of Akiko Tanaka, undated entry. "Their kindness is a poison more potent than any cyanide. It dissolves our will. It makes us forget who we are. I watch Hana-san. She speaks of the future. She has forgotten. I cannot forget." the moment in that tent, when the American woman touched the vial and felt nothing. It was then I truly became a ghost in a living body. I failed to die for the Emperor, and now I live in the care of his enemies. There is no greater shame. The vial no longer feels like a tool of honor. It feels like a key to a door I was too cowardly to open. Weeks bled into months. August 1945 arrived, bringing with it a heat so oppressive it felt like a physical weight. Whispers began to circulate through the camp, carried by new prisoners and sympathetic Nisei guards. They were fragments of a terrifying new reality, a city called Hiroshima, then another called Nagasaki, erased from the earth by a single bomb. The news was too fantastic to be believed, and yet it seeded a new kind of dread. The war had entered a realm beyond human comprehension. On August 15th, the routine was broken. The prisoners were assembled in the dusty central square under the searing sun. The American camp commander, flanked by armed guards, stood on a wooden crate. The Nisei translator's face was ashen. A crackly radio had been placed beside him. "Today," the translator announced, his voice trembling slightly, "His Majesty, the Emperor of Japan, will address the nation. You are ordered to listen." A stunned silence fell over the prisoners. The Emperor. His voice was sacred, divine, not something to be broadcast over a machine. Akiko felt a knot of ice form in her stomach. This could only mean one thing. The radio hissed to life. From the static emerged a high-pitched, formal voice that none of them had ever heard. It was the Gyokuon-hoso, the jewel voice broadcast. The language was archaic and courtly, but the message, as it slowly sank in, was devastatingly clear. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. Moreover, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb. Men who had stared down death without flinching now openly wept. Some collapsed to their knees, their faces contorted in grief and disbelief. Japan had lost. The divine mission was over. Everything they had fought for, sacrificed for, and been willing to die for had turned to ash. But as Akiko listened, one phrase cut through her personal fog of shame. "We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all the generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable." Enduring the unendurable. The words came directly from her God, her Emperor. He was not asking for their deaths. He was commanding them to live, to suffer, to bear the shame, and to endure. That night, Akiko lay on her cot in the darkness, listening to the quiet sobs that filled the tent. The vial, her gyokusai, was no longer a burning coal of shame. It felt like a relic from a dead religion. Her failure to die was no longer a personal cowardice. It had been, by a strange twist of fate, an unknowing adherence to the Emperor's final, most difficult order. With quiet, deliberate movements, she sat up. Using a small sewing needle she had traded for a portion of her rice ration weeks ago, she carefully picked at the threads holding the vial in place. The tiny glass tube, her shattered jewel, fell into her palm. It looked so small, so insignificant. She slipped out of the tent and walked to the edge of the camp, near the foul-smelling latrine trench. The moon was a pale sliver in the sky. She looked at the vial one last time. It contained her honor, her duty, her father's expectations, and a world that no longer existed. It was the key to a door she no longer needed to open. She opened her hand. The vial dropped, making no sound as it was swallowed by the darkness and filth of the ditch. For the first time since leaving the jungle, Akiko Tanaka felt not honor, not shame, but a profound and terrifying emptiness. It was the feeling of survival. The war was over. Her war was just beginning.